Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending this session, which is called the City Attractiveness for Investment. The uncertainty of the world economy has aggravated competition for investment between different cities. So under such conditions, the success of the city authorities is not measured by the number of public events, tournaments, Olympic Games, but rather by the amount of and quality of jobs that have been created and which have been created up to now and that will be created in the future. So as to answer the question about the real content of real competition between cities in terms of raising investment, we've now got together a group of different parties. First of all, managers that are responsible for investments, for raising investments in the city governments. Mr. Markus from Frankfurt, Singapore, Mr. Dirk, and Moscow, Maxim Reshetnikov, head of the Economic Policy and Development Department, Alexei, Komissarov, Science, Business, and Sergei Lyovkin, the head of the Civil Construction Policies of Moscow. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there are global trends in the development of investments. And on this score, we'll have Roel, head of the PLI practices with IBM, the practice that recommends different companies where they should locate their manufacturing and production and managerial businesses. The general partner of the BCG in Russia, Dirk, and the third party, investors themselves. We have Igor Titov, here Vice President for External Relations, Renault Eurasia, and Sergei Belyakov, Deputy Minister of the Economic Development of the Russian Federation. Moscow is one of the biggest cities, but it's not all Russia, as you understand. The speakers are quite interesting, and the subject is very interesting, but we are a little bit tight in terms of our schedule. Please speak not more than 5 to 6 minutes. Only the first two presentations will be probably more, about 10 to 12 minutes. And what about the attractiveness of a city? The city appeal, the areas which are within the area of its own control, the external factors that impact the city, the factors that cannot be impacted, how the investment policies can promote a well-balanced development, and whether factors such as economic, apart from economic opportunities, but the development of infrastructure, transport, engineering structures. On the 15th of November 2013, on the World Forum on Direct Investment in Shanghai, IBM presented results of studies which were done jointly with Site Selection magazine. It's the biggest periodical in the world which helps corporations to choose different places for investments. The city rankings are published periodically on an annual basis. In these ratings, in the reports, analysis was done of the 100 biggest cities of the world and their attractiveness in terms of foreign investment. So the positions, the places they occupy in different rankings, such as most reliable cities and so on and so forth, most livable cities, with comparison of Moscow with other biggest cities in the world, Moscow's potential for growth in terms of competition. So that's what I would like to ask Roel Spee to talk about. So please, Roel.
Good morning, everyone. I will indeed talk about investment attractiveness, and particularly competitiveness of cities to attract companies to the location. I'd like to talk a little bit about the trends in recent years. Where have companies set up operations around the world and position Moscow in that overview? Then talk a little bit about the study that Oleg just announced, the competitiveness of cities around the world. We did a study among 100 cities and did that from an investor's perspective. And that's the new thing that I think is interesting this morning. It's a study that has not been published before, and it will show you a little bit better how companies look at cities when they have to decide where to establish an operation. The outcomes, as you will see, are a bit different from other rankings that you will see in the market. And at the end, make some conclusion on what we believe the potential is for Moscow going forward. We have limited time, so this will go a bit fast maybe, but I'm sure the presentation will be available afterwards, and the report also, of course. First of all, let's look at what in recent years has been happening and where companies have set up operations. What you see here is an overview of the last 10 years on how many jobs foreign investors have created around the world by setting up new operations. And I emphasize the word new because this does not include acquisitions of other companies, for example. What we are registering here is the decisions that companies make when they are establishing a new operation somewhere in the world, a manufacturing facility, a call center, and so on, and they create new jobs with that investment. For these investments, they really have to make a choice on where to locate the business, and that's what we want to track, and that's telling us something about the attractiveness of countries and regions and cities. So as you can see, over the last 10 years, there was an increase of jobs in the earlier years. Then you see the impact of the crisis very clearly in 2008 and 2009. And you also see slight recovery, but not continuing recovery in the latest years. What countries have attracted most of this investment in the last 5 years? I'm now focusing on the last 5 years. You see a couple of obvious countries like China and India. They attract a lot of jobs. A lot of companies have gone to those markets in recent years. Initially because it was low cost, but more and more they're also going there because the market itself is very attractive. So they're setting up operations in those countries to serve the market. The USA, for that reason, also is a very important one because it has a very strong consumer market. And as you can see, Russia actually also scores quite well. Over the last number of years, it has certainly come up as an investment destination, and companies have more and more established operations in the Russia environment, and mainly also because it's a very important market and certainly a growth market. A lot of companies see the opportunity of Russia going forward in the future. Now, if we look at cities, then we can see that Moscow is positioned also in the top 20, and number 19 to be exact, and if you focus on the European environment, it would be number 7. So again, it's a fairly good position to see where Moscow is positioned. You see also some obvious candidates, London and Singapore scoring very well, and they do very well already for many years. Locations that really are metropolitan areas that attract a lot of different types of operations, being headquarters, service centers, but also manufacturing in some ways. And some of these cities certainly do. Singapore and Shanghai, for example, attract a lot of manufacturing operations as well. Now, what's important is for Moscow that it attracts a lot of investment, but it mainly does that so far because it is a very strong market. The point was made this morning and in the opening session, the potential of the local market, the combination of the country's market and the local city market is a very, very powerful offer. And a lot of companies have identified that potential and are investing here for that reason. But the interesting thing, of course, is that if you want to further grow the economy, you should also try to attract investment that is not just coming here for the market, but that maybe adds something additional, some new technology, some new value added, and brings new skills to the market. And for that type of operation, you have to compete with other cities. And that's the type of investment we call contestable investment. Those are the investment projects that have a choice to locate either in Moscow or in St. Petersburg or in other international cities. Now, the ambition, I think, for Moscow is that it should increase the volume of contestable investment. It attracts a lot of market investment, and that will continue to come, but the ambition is to attract more contestable investment. And that's why over the last year, we've been looking with the city of Moscow at a project to look at the competitiveness. So for these type of projects, you need to compete with other cities, and let's now try to understand better how competitive cities are, what do cities need to do to become more competitive, and of course talk a little bit about Moscow in specific. Now, as Oleg already mentioned, there are a number of studies that have been produced over the years that talk about rankings in terms of best cities to do business or most livable cities and sometimes most competitive cities even. But we've never seen a study that really shows that there is a differentiation among sectors of industry, because there is no single place around the world that is best for everything. So a lot of these studies have a bit of disadvantages. They miss the true corporate investor perspective. That means you should really look at through the eyes of the investors at cities to understand what the real competitiveness is. There is a differentiation, obviously. A call center has very different requirements than a manufacturing facility. So the best cities for those operations will be different cities. But also, very important, most of these studies do not look at all at the costs of doing business in the cities. They look at qualitative factors, but don't take into account that there is also a price to invest in a city or to do business in a city. So we basically looked this year at 2 initiatives. We try to assess the true competitiveness through the eyes of the investor. That tells us best what investors are looking for, and therefore also how you can measure your competitiveness best. And certainly also try to understand where can we make improvements to become more competitive even than today. We've done this study together with Site Selection Magazine over the last year. We looked at 100 cities around the world, the largest cities and the cities that over the last number of years attracted a lot of investment. So we wanted to make sure we focus on those cities that companies are really most interested in. Then what we did is we looked at 5 different types of investment, and the main objective here was to really show that there is a variety of conclusions. Different types of industries have different needs and therefore look at different cities. So as you see here, there are 5 different operations. We looked at an international headquarters, a shared services center, which is an internal corporate center which combines a number of internal support functions. Sometimes it's referred to as a back office. What we did here is we looked at a more high-value shared service center where we combined various functions, and the reason we did that is that we're looking at major cities around the world. A back office would not typically look at these major cities. They would go to 2nd or 3rd tier cities. We looked at an ICT sector operation, a software development center here, again a higher value. We looked at a financial services industry, in this case competence center, and we looked at R&D, in particular in life sciences. The outcomes at the end should provide us various rankings that shows the differences. It's a qualitative ranking, as we call it. It's a financial ranking that tells us how financial attractive these cities are. But then we combine those things, and this is exactly what most consultants nowadays do when they work with companies. This cost-quality combination tells exactly what different propositions there are for companies to consider when they are preparing investments. Just to show you how that, where that is positioned. In the initial steps of location decision making, here you see a stepwise approach that most companies go through. In the initial steps, company looks at strategic factors to consider, and the objective there is really to identify those few cities that are the best options. And we call that a short list in this industry, a short list of locations that they would then consider in more detail. And in doing that, we use this approach. What you see here is a graphic that we produced for all these industries. And let me explain this concept. Because on one side, you have a cost analysis. You see that on the bottom. That is basically a straightforward calculation of either a return on investment that a company can expect in any of these cities, or an annual operating cost. If it's not making a profit, you can just purely look at cost. But it's showing the financial attractiveness of the cities for that particular operation. Now, there are many other factors which we call qualitative factors that you cannot translate into cost immediately. So, for example, the availability of skills is a very important one, or the quality of the infrastructure, or the stability of the political environment, or the risk for natural disaster. All kinds of different factors that companies may consider, but cannot immediately translate in cost, and we call that quality. Now, there's a qualitative index and there's a financial index, and if you then combine those two, you get this type of overview where the cities are plotted on a map. And you can see that there are different solutions there. So on the bottom you see routine activities would typically go for low-cost locations. So for example, the back offices that go to India. That's the type of solution that you see for those operations. If that is too risky, because you cannot find the skills, or because it's too risky from an earthquake or whatever it is, then you may look at other better options, but you pay a higher price. So you go for another type of solution. And you can imagine that the better or the higher quality operations like a research center and a headquarters and so on, they need really top locations. They go to the cities that have excellent airports, perfect living environment for expatriates, good quality of skills, universities and so on. And they care less about the fact that it's a bit more expensive. to operate there. So those show that there are different solutions for companies to choose from. And depending on what the company is trying to do, it will choose one of those solutions and select a couple of cities in that solution. You can imagine that companies will immediately eliminate the options on the bottom left because they are always weaker from both a qualitative and a financial perspective. That is not the type of location that companies are interested in. And actually, if a city is in that category, you should really start worrying yourself. If you're really constantly in that category, you need to make some improvements. Yeah. So let's look at an example from the study that we did, and let's also try to show you how that differs from some of these other rankings. So what you see here is the beginning of a map with all the 100 cities in there, but it shows you first of all the cities that scored also well in the latest study by Mercer, who does every year a quality of life ranking, and these were cities that ranked very high on the quality of life from Mercer. Now, if we add to that the cities that I just showed that attracted a lot of investment in the last 5 years, in red, so you see they're already slightly different positioned. And if we then add to that all the other cities that we included in the study, you get the complete picture that we looked at. And this is the example of the Life Sciences R&D Center. So it's a pharmaceutical R&D center with some pilot production in there, but that's the type of project that we looked at for this example. And you see that there is the trade-off between quality and cost. So you have top quality locations, but they may be less attractive from a cost perspective. And you have cost-efficient locations, but they may be less attractive from a qualitative perspective. In this particular example, you have a very interesting situation that two cities are scoring very well, in Singapore and Dublin. And in reality, indeed, for pharmaceutical industries, they're very attractive. A lot of pharmaceutical industries go there. One of the reasons is their tax environment. You also see that Moscow has a proposition in this overview, somewhat in the middle, so a fairly balanced proposition between cost and quality, which is a good thing. So there is an offer here that Moscow can take to the market and say, this is what we have to offer. We think you should consider the city for your investment. So that's an example. We did that for 5 different industries, as I mentioned. Here are some of the rankings. Now, in this type of analysis, we're looking at the major cities around the world. The types of projects that we looked at are a bit more focused on the qualitative dimension than on the cost dimension. So I'm giving you here the qualitative ranking. That's important to recognize. If you look at the worldwide rankings, the position of Moscow ranges from 50 to, let's say, 60, with one exception, shared services. That was to be expected that it would score a bit weaker there. Let's say 50 to 60. But if you then look at all the emerging economies, there's a quite good position for Moscow. So this tells us a couple of things. In comparison with, let's say, the mature economies like in North America and in Western Europe, okay, there are multiple cities that are still doing better. So there is a challenge and try and get into that category. But if you look at the emerging economies, which includes top cities such as Dubai as well, and Kuala Lumpur, those are a few that score a bit better than Moscow. Moscow is in that lead category. So it shows there's been made a lot of progress over the last number of years. And I think the next challenge is to make it into that category of global leaders. In the study, we also looked a bit more at what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses. How can you use the strengths to go to market? And the weaknesses are some areas to be improved. And Mr. Reshetnikov will talk a bit more on that in detail. But if you look at the strengths, there's very interesting 2 messages there. 2 of the main factors that companies look at when they have to make decisions where to invest around the world is the market. Where are my customers? Where do I need to go and serve my customers in their market? And the second key question is, I need talent. I need people to do the job. I need good people to do the job. So those are 2 major dimensions that companies look at. And if you look at the 2 key strengths of Moscow City, those are exactly the 2 points. So there's huge potential there to leverage those selling points and go to market with them. A variety of other strengths, we will not go to all the details here in the interest of time. On the improvement areas, there I think it's important to indicate that the city cannot do everything. That some of these improvements need to be done by federal government on the regulatory side. So that's also important to understand. It's a mix of things really. And finally, let's say look at what the ambition should be. Moscow is in the category, let's say, of the getting close to high quality, but not yet there. And it's a bit more expensive than the average location, as you will see in the other examples in the study. The ambition should really be to become that high quality, get part of that cluster of high quality options that companies can choose from. That's the type of value add, and I think the comment was made earlier this morning, value added type of operation that can be attracted. The Other options at the bottom end there are not really competitors for Moscow. I mean, if I always give examples of if companies come to Moscow and they say, I'm also looking at India, well, sorry, but then you should go to India. But those are very, very different locations. You don't compete with India. What you compete with is the locations in that same cluster up there. That's the type of solution that you compete with. For the future, you have to be aware that some of these upcoming locations in that category of transitioning economies, they gradually become better. They will also become more expensive, but that's something to watch for in the future. So I wanted to keep it there as an introduction. Maybe there's some time for questions later on. The report that you see there, the one on the right particularly, that's the report that we're talking about here. It will be online available in about a week. So it's not there yet. Don't check it yet, but it will be there in a week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roel. So basically, this is the outcome of a statistic analysis based on 10 years of watching the market. И это то, что базируется на фактах.
This is what is based on fact, on the decisions that have been made by the company in reality. That's why it's highly important that the next viewpoint should be presented by Igor Titov, because Igor is actually speaks on behalf of those who are chased by the city authorities. He's representing investors and loyal investors who are supposed, as people think, are fleeing away from Moscow. The automobile factories, the car manufacturers clusters that have grown up in the Moscow outskirts, in Kaluga, in St. Petersburg. Kaluga is not the biggest city of the world. Nevertheless, Kaluga attracts huge amount of investment, and it's almost on the periphery, on the outskirts of the new Greater Moscow. Well, perhaps you are fed up with Moscow. You're sick and tired of Moscow. Maybe you can go to some other places where there are less traffic jams, or do you see any advantages in Moscow? This is a very big issue. We've been working in Moscow since 1998. So in recent time, as we were communicating with our colleagues, investors, foreign counterparties, we've seen some really upset looks and questions. Aren't you going to get away from Moscow because the land is very expensive and there are other factors behind this? And so the same questions I address our suppliers or just foreign and businessmen that have chosen other regions. So the answer is the land is too expensive and wages are too high. So I decided to spend some time calculating whether these particular components are really important to us and whether we were right in choosing Moscow. So I've calculated some variables, the cost of labor, logistics, other resources, investment climate, the city support, and this is the outcome. So let's start with the labor, especially in the machine building industry. So when in the 20s, it was 20 to 30% of the cost of the product. Now it's about 15%. So it's about 20% to us. Even if we could move to another region, I think the figures would be roughly the same. But that's hypothetical. The next factor is quite important. Is the power supply, power industry. The cost of resources such as heat, water, it's higher. Of course, the cost of power is higher in Moscow, about 10%. Heat, twice as more expensive. Land is 3 times more expensive. So taking into account all these factors that are accepted in Moscow, so we see the real losses generated by that. But when we start computing electricity, power supply, including land, water, gas, and the rest, it turns out that our operation costs in Moscow could be, in Kaluga, they could be even 60% more as compared to our current costs in Russia. In Kaluga, yeah, that's true. These are actually figures from Kaluga site, but we do not calculate here the cost of connecting these utilities to the utilities network. So for new investors, I understand the government of Moscow proposes to take these services at the existing industrial areas. So, I mean, given our current resources and energy resources, we could have lost 2.5 billion rubles if we could use these resources. So you ask me, well, perhaps the wage factor is better. So then let's look at the situation. So as I was trying to compare with Kaluga, the cost of labor average wages in the car industry in Kaluga is twice as more as compared to electrical and technical engineering industry, and 50% more than in the financial sphere. So as a result, we have the so-called reserve labor army. So Moscow has a great edge, a great advantage, a huge backup, huge labor reserve. And that's how Moscow helps us to resolve all these problems. The problem of personnel turnover, and I'm sure that Renault and other car manufacturers can find replacement easily. And highly skilled personnel is always available. And I know that other regions also face the same problem, not only those adjacent to Moscow, because people switch jobs and the salaries just in search of better salaries. So this advantage is actually melting down. Now, as regards logistics, as far as we know, even if we could. If we were located in another region, we should have had a head office in Moscow. And logistics warehouse is also important. But even without the cost of the logistics warehouse, I made my calculations. For example, for St. Petersburg, we had to deliver 6% of our shipments via Moscow, and 93% of all deliveries should have been sent via Moscow to Kaluga. So the cost of logistics would have been 10% higher had our facilities been located in Kaluga. So we have thousands of containers delivered on an annual basis, and we buy. Well, of course, we do buy something in Kaluga, so the incoming shipments would be the same. So there's another conclusion that we can make is that Moscow is actually the center, the hub for all transport routes. So it's quite more comfortable to locate your production facilities right here. So we know that some types of products that we buy, components produced in Moscow, and similarly those produced in other regions, the cost of such products are even less in Moscow. So a conclusion that I can make, recommending the investors that are looking at Russia as a prospective place for investment, please don't forget about Moscow. Well, of course, you should look at other areas, industrial zones, our neighbors, Technopolis, for example, which have ready-made land plots for different types of production. But well, I'm sure that there are different methods of calculation, energy resources, so on and so forth. But let me say at this point, well, what was the problem of traffic jams? If we could calculate this as well, perhaps we could have some other conclusions. Well, let's not talk about traffic jams today because I think it's already everybody's fed up with this subject. But I think it's quite an unexpected conclusion.
In principle, I'll repeat, the industry that was supposed to go peripheral feels in Moscow quite well, wonderfully feels. that in general, what is your understanding of the BCG? You're one of the largest consultants of the corporate strategy. What advantages do you see in Moscow? What advantages do you see in the urban environment? And in general, the detailed structural vision of the factors is the strong side. I'll remind a famous story that says that when for one kick of the hammer was asked for $1,000, they say $20 for the kick of the hammer, and the rest is where to kick with the hammer and what's so good in Moscow to kick the hammer. Presentation of yen, please. I'll be speaking Russian because Moscow is an international city, is quite a well-established city without knowledge of Russian language. Foreigners seem to me are not lucky. So the next slide, please. Roel showed in his presentation that Moscow possesses high potential. It is shown by different surveys of the investors that perceive Moscow as the city with high investment opportunity. This is also confirmed by the presence of the international companies such as IBM and so on. But the major objective for the city is the realization of this potential. Next slide, please. For the investors, this investment attractiveness of Moscow is being formed from different factors. And Roel already slightly touched upon this. First of all, Moscow is the largest sales market, not only for Russia, but also the agglomeration in Europe is one of the largest markets. The population of 12 million is very big potential. The second point is that Moscow is the city with the high scientific potential. And international research regarding education also proves that there are many smart people. It's not just smart people, not only clever people, but the organizations that are in business of research and development that work in the cities such as Skolkovo, the number of the patents from Moscow coming, this number is quite impressive. The third point is the business climate. And here you see the presence of international corporations is the sign that this is very positive climate place, and this enhances image of the city. The fourth point is that entire infrastructure, we're not talking about roads, we're talking about the other infrastructure that in comparison to the various cities of Russia and the largest cities abroad, it's very well elaborated. This is very important prerequisite for development of the region. There's also central topic. This is the quality of life, because, next slide please, because the further expansion and utilization of the potential is impossible without highly educated specialists with education and people with such education. And what do these people say? They say that Moscow is interesting because there are more opportunities and that the salary is quite higher. On the other hand, as to the quality of life, there are still more margin left. And the last slide, please. This is just a little bit of the slides from consultancy. It says so much data. Here we show horizontally, these are all sectors of business. The horizontally, where the city plays important role and where the business plays important role. And the vertical axis shows the potential of the growth of the gross domestic product based on the facilities and the labor performance. Because Moscow, as the center, as the magnet, is not heavy industry city, is the city of different kinds. If we look at what is shown here, what we have several industries where we have high potential, and the role of the city must be the focus on the conditions for development of such businesses. There is, in the bottom on the right, there is a number of industries and the kinds of activities that are very important for the city, that we call supporting functions for the industries. This matrix gives the city some sort of a roadmap, such as where to focus and where to help. Thank you, Jan. Especially it's pleasant that you made your personal investment in success of Moscow using Russian in so free way. Now we heard the consultants, we heard the investor. Now the city needs to say something, because if you look, especially important for me is the one observation. Look, there is so-called the mid-revenue and mid-position trap. Moscow is in this situation, such as it's not among the quality leaders and not among the cost leaders in terms of economical efficiency of businesses. Does the city policy how to get out of this trap? Because where to focus efforts, how to do it, what should be done by the city government, what should be city government trying to attempt. Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues. I don't know, after presentation of Igor, do I need to say something on behalf of the city, because it seems to me that business said it all perfectly. But if you allow me, I will try to echo what was said. See, on the graph, you see the graph of the of investments in dollar denomination, and we see from year to year these numbers grow. Even more so, this year we expect 7% of growth of investments, and considering high base of the last year, it's quite decent number. And then when we receive reputable rating institution numbers, and we can see position that is somewhere in the middle, we always feel cognitive dissonance, because what is happening beyond the window, statistics, development of the city, and what we see in the reports don't quite correlate. And of course, the first question, the traditional question, is the question to the mirror, question to the rating. What kind of rating is this? What does it consider and what it does consider? Really, the ratings suffer one mishap. They consider conditions, they consider quality of carrying out business and living in the city, but they fully shave the profitability, such as with such risk and such revenue investor can earn. And very important is that, and thank you, Mr. Spee, that in his presentation and other colleagues, they looked at the quality and the margin. From this standpoint, the presented information is not just some sort of abstract something. They told us where you are. It's really a great instrument for analysis and goal setting. based on the fact that Moscow is forced, it must compete, and we compete not with the other cities of Russian Federation, but we compete with the global, powerful financial, historical, and cultural centers. And this, of course, is our strategic goal. Even more so, according to the ratings. There is a question about objectivity, comparability. Sergei will not let me lie, but 2 years we're fighting on the list of the procedures. Sergei is spending much time about this. There are no procedures. Majority of procedures regarding doing business in Russia, such as in the sphere of the civil construction, they all started in 2004, since the urban code they were cancelled. But the experts keep reading those articles to us, and we built the evaluation of the city in different ways, especially those who never been to the city. They base their opinion on external sources of information from some agencies, and those who really are, who live here, who carry out business here inside of the cities, everything except for the traffic jams. Moscow traffic jams are seen from everywhere, but the quality of conducting business is assessed higher by those who are already here and by those who conduct business here. And no questions, trying to blame the mirror is the honorable duty for us, but we still, the country grown on Dostoevsky, have a tradition of self-analysis. But any publication of rating makes us to once again and once again look carefully at ourselves, look at our positioning, procedure, and not ask questions. What do we want? What do we want really when you look at any rating and if you break it up into the elements? So the question is, what is the purpose of this rating? And investments abstract cannot exist. Investments are concrete. You have to see the set of the factors that lay in the foundation of the assessment. Most importantly is to set the goal. In what sphere we compete, for what investment we compete. And here I'd like to express my thanks to the research authors once again and point to you the specifics. The term questionable and the resilient investment and questionable and movable demand. If we look carefully at what's happening in Moscow, Moscow is developing, and the investments that we see in Moscow, these are investments forced by the demand. In other words, unquestionable demand, investments demand into the retail space, office space. We see there's very much of the deficit of such spaces. That's why so much investment is done. When we look at the rating, they assess absolutely different thing. They assess our capacity to compete for questionable, complex investments. So the city has many objectives. Oleg said, the problem of middle position. Next slide. One more. Moscow is located at the crossroads of two summaries. The upper summary is the cities that for slightly more money, let's go back, for little more money, but has substantially better quality. And the right bottom quartile says of lesser quality, but offer lesser price. So Moscow has to determine what direction to go, with whom to compete. It is clear that movement right bottom is not good for us, because obviously there will be always cities that will be winning against us. Our movement is only up and to the right, as much as the situation will allow us, but this is our strategic goal and we perfectly understand it. Next slide, please. We conducted, next slide, yes, colleagues. All right, we conducted jointly with the colleagues quite deep research of the investment climate, discovered weak and strong sides. We discovered all the factors of investment, divided into 3 groups: potential for business, condition of holding business, and place for living. Because place for living is really one of the key factors of attraction of the competent working force and retaining working force that creates new economy of that very creative class. Please notice those numbers: 20, 30, and 60%. These numbers, these are our valuations of how much city itself, the government of the city itself, are capable of impacting. As for potential for business, we realize that overwhelming majority is the factor of the national jurisdiction. In other words, the quality of the institutes, quality of the judicial authorities, quality of law enforcement, macroeconomics, and all the other questions. So it's very pleasant that Sergei Yurievich is next to me, and he shares with the federal government together, shares the responsibility for investment climate. Because, of course, when we talk that Moscow should compete with the other world capitals, with other cities, we cannot go away from the context of the general legislation, the country climate, general country climate. We usually move along with the colleagues, just like them. In their investment policy, they are hostages of what's happening in Moscow. Let's recall the rating, so-called doing business in Moscow, where majority of procedures are assessed on the basis of Moscow numbers and realizes. So we count on collaboration. In the other directions, we see the share of influence of the city and responsibility of the city. It's much higher as the place for living. It's responsible for this responsibility of the city, and we acknowledge this responsibility. What we analyzed carefully, those factors, we developed a system of the concrete solutions. What and how we should do, even more so, it's not some separate additional policy of the city. It's investment aspects for every, without exclusion, direction of our policy, in taxation policy, in tariff policy, in land relationship and ownership relationships. All these instruments are among many subject of the government and our goals of the investment attractiveness of the city. All they we formulated into the so-called investment strategy that is for the first time presented today, and we will continue discussing it with the business people, and we will make it more comprehensive. Why I'm saying more comprehensive? Because in our point of view, we have to single out very local, very clear, very concrete numbers. You cannot work on investment strategy and investment attractiveness in general, hoping that you'll find 1 or 2 wonderful solutions that will pull entire investment attractiveness of the city. It doesn't happen. Investment attractiveness is hundreds and thousands of very concrete solutions, very concrete areas and spheres. And the government of Moscow for the last 3 years is doing this in the area of the civil construction. Much is done in the industry of industrial policy, in the area of the headquarters protecting the rights of the entrepreneurs. Many numbers change from day to day. So this is the token that the investment attractiveness of the city on the international arena, in position of the international center for Moscow. And the last slide, I'd like to emphasize that we single out concrete spheres where the work is being done, because as you understand, the largest risk is spread out. When you have thousands of solutions, you risk not doing a one. So we work on prioritization of the system. The system of the priorities is being offered. It does not, of course, mean that all other spheres, nothing is going to be done. No questions. This is a comprehensive movement, complex movement. So these are key priorities, and these priorities, we every day orient our efforts. Thank you, Maxim, for, first of all, you were very precise on time, and second, could nod towards the federal power, because Sergei Prada, in majority of the industry that Maxim showed, there's factor international mobility of personnel. That is important. If I do consulting project or I do project of developing software, then sometimes I need in 2 days to move a person from across the world. And I'm certainly sure that Moscow can enable to do this, and also with the help of some connections with the federal bodies. What do federal bodies do for this? And the second, much was done for the provincial development, and the minister said it's so good in Moscow. How about this balance from the standpoint of the federal authority? Yes, thank you. I will start from the second question. I would say in general that Moscow is in a unique situation, unique with the sign plus. In all the presentations, the central topic was the topic of the quality of life, the question of favorable condition. I'm not talking about investment conditions, conditions for investment. It breaks up into points, such as conditions for business, and if the thing is more or less good, you can look at it as the condition for living for the citizens. Here, things are not quite clear, but for the business, it's not so unclear. What about uniqueness of Moscow situation? If you compare Moscow with the other cities of Russia, with all of them, including St. Petersburg, yes, Moscow is very attractive for living. So these are the factors that Jan was speaking about, and many other factors and opportunities, and the revenues and self-realization and quality of life, and even quality of the consumer services that Vyacheslav was referring as the risk zone, and even all the costs related to infrastructure that doesn't manage with so many inhabitants. Still, this is the factor of rather good characterization of Moscow in comparison to other cities of other countries. So citizens from different countries and places come to Moscow, and it's a good source of labor resources for the companies that in Moscow operate. They can engage highly qualified personnel with less demands in terms of salary in comparison to Muscovites. I'm Muscovite, by the way. And business behaves exactly like this. Moscow is attractive for investment, high revenue despite of difficulty of winning Moscow market, Russian market, Commonwealth market, and providing presence in Moscow. Of course, for them, Moscow is an attractive city. But if you compare Moscow with other cities, non-Russian cities, then Moscow in many ways loses. Honestly and sincerely. And it's not, of course, about traffic jams. Not only traffic jams. Question comes, is Moscow attractive or non-attractive city? You have to create conditions for comfortable living. Where's the benchmark you have to meet? I'm certainly convinced that fighting for foreign investments in investors, fighting for foreign companies that they can be placed in here, it's not enough to decrease business risks. You have to make sure that the managers, top leaders of any foreign company, all foreign citizens can find the customer service they're used to if they come here and they feel good here, then will not experience any problems, and the business will direct its feet here. Speaking very simply, if you have an opportunity not to go to Russia and to Moscow, they don't go. I just know by my experience, it's not claim against Moscow, it's the claim to all of us. We're faced with this when call colleagues for some conferences and events that we organize. We need to have their expert support and personal participation. If there's just one reason not to go, they don't go to Russia. So we hold the events in Moscow quite frequently, not only in Moscow, in some other cities as well. As to other business centers in other countries, we have big investment flow, small investment flow. You want to go there. You want to conduct something there because you want to go there. So this is quite simple. If I want to come to Moscow, then money will come here. If I don't want to come here, then money that come to Moscow will have more speculative nature that's very delicately react on attractiveness or non-attractiveness, or favorability, non-favorability, and so on, even on the period. This important factor, we don't forget it. We're not even talking about, hey, let's work with Moscow. I don't want to emphasize too much this issue, but how to make the quality of living in Moscow corresponding to high demands that not we formulate. It's not we are used to the quality of life, but in other cities of Russia. But this is demands of the best practice, world best practices of financial centers, and we need to be in tune with the world centers. So this is a little bit of bitterness. Now, this is just the assessment of the situation. I see just before my eyes the change the situation in Moscow from the standpoint of the customer services and the costs. Cost I imply not only how much I want to buy this or that service, but some informal costs and spendings related to getting access to any service. This situation radically is changing for the better, and this is very pleasant. What is happening? We launched the program of improvement of investment climate. Moscow has really become a central link because the city is being assessed, has become the source of good practice, what can be done, and how successful can it be done if the goal is determined, if all the team of the city is tuned. The colleagues from Moscow, why so pleasant to work with them? They say, we can do this, and then there's a list of objective reasons. We need to do this. From your side, we need these actions. This is normal dialogue. And yes, our mandate, and this is the federal mandate, and they say on the federal level we can't do this. This effect is much more important rather than just linear change in the rating of doing business. It's good because it shows something. It sets the stimuli, this change of mentality of regional authorities that we can translate to the other provinces, and this is already happening. The colleagues come to study how to do stuff without looking for excuses for not doing something. It's precious by itself. That is why I'm very optimistically looking at this, and what I started to say secondly, and conditions for business. Moscow chronologically became for me the related things for the Muscovite who lives in this city and who does a lot to make sure that the residents of the city feel good, and that the foreigners who are in the category that are critically attituded. This is the change that is taking place in Moscow. It has become a more comfortable place for residents in comparison to the recent past.
First of all, if we do want this, not in words but in deed, I think we can do it. I think there's a stereotype that Russians take a long time to get ready for something, to prepare for something, but they run very fast afterwards. I think it's just a stereotype, because Moscow is a kind of a city where the city authorities now have turned facing its citizens. Well, Maxim referred to return on investment, but that's not the key criterion. I think that's a city that is now facing businesses and its citizens and the population, so as to meet the demands of the businesses and the city population. And the third important point, the practices that we have we are now witnessing in Moscow, is not generated on the federal level. It's generated in the regions. And I think these sort of practices can be implemented in other regions, and that's what we really would like to do. Well, this is an urbanistic forum, although it's touches upon Moscow problems, but it's also dedicated to other cities and other regions. We have more cities with a population above 1 million than in any other countries in the world. In the United States, they have only 8 such cities. We have 12 or 13 cities with population over 1 million. So we are second only to China in this respect. So I think we should really use these effects, and that's what we are expecting. That's what we would like to see, actually. So I often use this phrase, we are doomed to success. But we are doomed to success only when we have the relevant motivation, the relevant incentives, just as the Moscow city administration. Maxim said that we are pushing them to do something, but quite often it's vice versa. It's Moscow that pushes us towards something. So let me draw an example of the visit to Washington, D.C., the World Bank headquarters, just to explain what exactly we are doing, why the expected effects should be estimated in a different way. I think it was Moscow authorities that actually forced us to go there to convince the people in the World Bank. So I think that's what we are going to do further on, and because we do have a certain blue area of real edge, real advantages. And I think we can achieve success by directed action, directed effort in any areas, in construction, power industry. But how we can deal with the risk zones, with the red zone, to move them from the red zone into the green zone, that's another problem. That's what we are expected to do in the nearest time. So thanks a lot to city administration for their activity, and we will try to develop these practices in the regions. I think people should live comfortably, not only in Moscow, but elsewhere. Thank you. Let me change a little bit the order of presentations that we've had initially, because Moscow to Russia is probably what Frankfurt is to Germany. This is a kind of a city which everyone is sort of jealous, because in terms of its leader position, investment. So I would like to ask a question to Markus Frank, a question about the investment strategy chosen by Frankfurt, which has gone a long way forward in terms of quality, and whether how it really works, whether this strategy probably, so the lower return on investment in the city, how can you balance out this? What kind of leverages do you use to ensure that? So actually, that was quite an interesting discussion. Let me congratulate you from the bottom of my heart with the results that Moscow has achieved over the last 15 years. I think you should be proud of what you've managed to achieve, given all the problems. Even to me, as a person who is looking at the situation from outside, I think you've done quite a lot of things. And I had a chance to talk to your mayor, and I told him the same thing. What Moscow has achieved is really impressive. Thank you for organizing this forum. I think it's really interesting when experts from different countries can get together in one place. We are dealing with similar issues, actually, in many countries. Therefore, I would like to say thanks to the government of Moscow. I think we should not say that we are looking for the cheapest place or the most efficient place. I think Frankfurt has gone the same area, the same direction. So a few years ago, we had a meeting and we discussed what is most important for the development of the city. For example, I don't think anyone could have thought about producing manufacturing cars in Frankfurt on the Main. We do have a large car industry. We are developing car technologies and components, but no manufacturing facilities in facility. Nevertheless, Frankfurt is one of the hugest, one of the biggest financial centers in Germany. So I think we should work towards a higher financial attractiveness. Frankfurt is the center of financial industry. It's a very good venue for pharmaceuticals, for chemistry. Most people, when they see skyscrapers in Frankfurt, they think, well, there's nothing, just big banks. But this is not so. We do have important industries in Frankfurt, especially pharmaceuticals. These are important industries that are investing in us. Also, apart from that, logistics, mobile industries. Over the last few years, we've invested in the development of infrastructure in Frankfurt, analog infrastructure, such as Frankfurt Airport, for example. You know, Frankfurt acts collectively on many issues. You can reach any city in Europe. Within 2 hours, you'll be able to reach any city in Europe, except for Moscow, of course, within 2 hours. So we've tried to invest in transportation, in transport routes, in expanding our airport. Frankfurt is also an important center for railway infrastructure. We've also invested in digital infrastructure, as digital infrastructure is one of the important subjects when businesses choose where they should go. It's important not only to reach Frankfurt by air or by railway, but it's also important to transmit a large amount of data through different networks. So this digital infrastructure has been a real breakthrough in our economy. 80% of the German internet traffic goes via Frankfurt, 40% of the entire European internet traffic. So the analog infrastructure joined by digital infrastructure made Frankfurt such an attractive place. But answering your question, well, of course, there must be underlying strategy. There must be certain principles. You cannot chase after each business persuading it. So you have to make your choice to find out what areas, what particular industries do you really need badly. So when you invest in infrastructure, you need to invest in people as well, in human resources, investment in education, investment in the smart heads. And we feel that many people do want to work in Frankfurt because it's not only a good opportunity for making money, for earning something. Frankfurt is not a cheap place, of course, but it's a high-quality venue. And people come here because we do have many good jobs. But we have to offer something to these people, ranging from kindergartens, educational establishments. I think families should feel comfortable at our place, and those who come to Frankfurt are supposed to get one of the best educations in the world. And this is how this complex program has emerged. So we know that the competition is going to be even more rigid, and Frankfurt will continue to be highly competitive, and we focus our efforts on that. So let me congratulate Moscow with your achievements. I think you've done quite a lot, and we are cooperating quite much with your city. I'm sure that the government of Moscow can be really proud of what they've done over the recent years, and I'm saying this as a person looking from outside. Well, of course, I'm trying to take a critical look, but on the other hand, you've done quite a lot. Thank you for organizing this forum. Thank you, Markus. I think that was very good reflection, very good small mirror for Maxim. So let's go a little bit deeper now, the two areas which are always the most important for investors. What exactly can a city offer, and how a city can encourage this focus focused industries. What industries are there? I think this is a question to Alexei Komissarov for the Department of Business, Industry and Science in the government of Moscow. So how you are going to build this from the practical vantage point, where the investors should come as a result? Thank you. As Markus said, it's important to focus on certain concrete, specific areas rather than wait for investors. So in Maxim's presentation, they pointed towards certain branches that we consider priority industries. So we have a list of priorities, and of course we've started doing something already in this area. We'll start doing this in the nearest future. First of all, IT, microelectronics, and biotechnologies. And now we will also have contacts on medical equipment. What exactly is being done right now? Well, I think the previous speakers have referred to this. Infrastructure is highly important in this respect. For the first time ever, Moscow 2 years ago began to think and started to pursue a policy to attract investors, not only those who invest in housing or offices construction, but also in high-tech industries. And I think in this point it's quite important what Dirk has said about the preliminary construction of infrastructures, about early construction of infrastructures. I think over the 2-year period we've done quite much. We've set up the Moskva Technopolis mentioned by Igor, hundreds of thousands square meters of floor space that are going to be filled in towards the end of next year. And I can tell you for sure that it was implemented quite fast, and Mr. Liu Thai Ker will confirm what I've said. We've communicated in Singapore. In countries like Singapore, nobody is expecting that a techno park, a hub like that, is going to be filled within 1 or 2 years. It's always like 5 or 6 years, depending on the volume. So I think it's quite important to focus on that, not only the floor space, but the physical structure, but also on auxiliary services. For example, in Technopolis, Moscow, we have a special customs station where innovation products can be cleared within half an hour, customs clearance. It used to be quite a formidable problem in our country, and sometimes it took months, even up to 6 months, to get a customs clearance. The second important area is personnel, the human resources. Everybody was saying that it's one of the Moscow's competitive edges, the availability of personnel, a great number of students, scientific establishments. From my communications with managers of major foreign and Russian companies, I can say that given the availability, well, there is no availability of ready-made or ready-trained personnel. That's why everybody has to undergo some kind of training. We need to prepare, to train people. That is why we've decided that we launch a new program next year, the training of engineers. It is performed jointly by the government of Moscow and the Rosnano Corporation. So we've chosen the best universities and the best programs. So I urge the representatives of companies to join this program. By the way, the students of the best engineering institutes and universities will undergo on-the-job training at companies, and we believe that it's quite a good experiment that will make it possible to resolve the problem of imbalances between the skill level and the actual availability of facilities. As another important challenge is the development of industrial areas. Many people have referred to this. These industrial zones, industrial areas occupy the area which is almost equals almost half of Paris area. And I can tell you that at this exhibition, you will be able to see some concepts from TDI company, Daniel, an architect who has created some of these concepts. So this is a concept for the development of 3 zones. One of them is the Yuzhny port, southern port, which is now being developed around the Technopolis Moskva project, and also the points of growth. The second zone is Zelenograd. Zelenograd is a special city which was actually set up as a microelectronic cluster 50 years ago. Now we are facing the task, a unique task, I would say, to revive this microelectronic cluster. And the third industrial area, which is represented at the exhibition today, is the south of Moscow, the Kolomenskoye area. Just an example for the Muscovites, it's a small piece of Moscow, actually, in area twice as much as Venice, for example, in area. So developing this zone will allow us to raise additional investment and create additional opportunities for businesses. And the last point I wanted to mention today is that it's highly important for us to ensure that the city is as open as possible. That's what we've started doing since the end of December. Since the end of December, the city administration will be publishing the needs. It's not an order for specific goods or services, but we will we will announce the problems, the real challenges. Well, different cities, they are trying to seek different solutions. There is an international organization, and Moscow is not alone in this respect. It's not unique. So we all will try to find solutions that will alleviate the search for such solutions, and also we are going to address businesses who hopefully will be able to help us to resolve these problems, raising interesting investments. Just in closing, let me tell you about a few things that will be helpful to make the city as comfortable as possible. Let me emphasize that this city should be comfortable for foreigners. I think it's quite a risky statement. It should be comfortable for everyone, not only for foreigners. Yeah, I think Mr. Dirk spoke in Russian very well, which shows not only his ability, but it's a kind of forced. He was forced to do that because for a person who doesn't speak Russian, it's hard to live in Moscow because there are no signs in Latin. So we have now developed a program to increase the friendly atmosphere. So let's talk about people. Let's not talk about foreigners, but say people speaking foreign languages. Okay. Now, just a few words referring to what Mr. Markus said. We should not get hold trying to bring all investors, taking them by hand. What is difficult to disagree with that. Germany has always been a country, an example to us in terms of systemic approach. So, but we are ready to bring investors here anyway, just virtually bringing them by hand, helping them to resolve the problems that we are facing in the city, so we could have as many positive examples as possible and to create better ratings. Thank you very much. Just let me give the floor to Sergei Lyovkin with the following question. So we have large-scale projects like 2 Venice areas, some other small cities that you compare Moscow. Well, in fact, they are creating the granulated urban environments. So what I mean is that, for example, if you want to resolve the transport problem, well, of course, it's would be quite convenient to touch upon the residential areas as well, so where we can create polycentric space. But that will require huge investments, more construction projects, and until recently, Moscow has been a very bad example. Everybody was referring to formalities and bureaucracies, and the procedures. So what can be done in this area? Dear friends, not colleagues, I would like to emphasize that you're friends, because in order to make the city attractive for investments, it is impossible unless we pool our efforts, unless the authority joins its efforts with the businesses. So it's really absolutely agree with the statement that it's impossible to think about the development of the city without civil construction, and that's why our mayor has set us with the task of lifting all administrative barriers, all bureaucratic barriers, which is not always easy to perform. We have to develop legislation ranging from land law to environment law, civil construction, and so on and so forth. Therefore, sometimes even our own investors do not always understand how they should go about this, to say nothing of foreign investors. That is why we have the task of preparing procedures, preparing rules. That is why in 2012 all civil construction procedures were enacted and they were approved and confirmed by the government of Moscow. These are 8 state services and 2 state functions. Well, I'm sure you understand what it means, what it implies when an investor, a businessman, understands where he should go to get what he wants to provide, where he wants to get a certain service. Well, because prior to that, any authority could refuse, and it could turn down a businessman without any reason whatsoever. Today, this is ruled out. So we have new procedures. Out of 16 programs that are available in Moscow right now, the Moscow is developing under special programs. The 4 programs are related to certain civil construction, civil engineering procedures, which are aimed towards alleviating these procedures. Apart from that, I'm not going to outline the different details and nuances. You can read about this on the website of the Moscow city office, city council. So regarding the digital format, 7 procedures have already been transferred into a digital format, so you understand what it means, because the activities of the developers and customers are now become much simpler. So using the websites, they can track down any procedures, they can provide their comments, and they can also get answers in electronic format. Well, you don't have the need to get in touch with a particular bureaucrat, and that, understand, will elevate the process very much. So when we were developing these procedures and converting this into a digital format, we faced a certain problem. The problem was about investors and developers. Somehow we felt that they ignored that their lives became much easier. So they didn't even realize they don't have to carry tons of paper when they need some approvals, planning permits, and so on and so forth. Sometimes it's a truckload of documents that they have to carry to sign different payments. So all they have to do now is to download these documents and to archive them to to file them in their archives. So the digital signature is already approved, and they can do this easily. So we need to start a program of training for investors and developers. So we've organized a series of workshops. We've carried out about 47 such workshops, providing training to 850 employees from different business structures, as 280 from 280 companies. So as you can see, this sort of work has not led to the actual digital format of all documentation, but at least it demonstrated to investors and developers that they have now huge prospects and opportunities. So we are doing increasingly more in this area. So we've already managed to go through formalities in more than 850 applications using this digital signature and digital format. So it's quite a big figure. So we are pretty sure that 2014 will be a key period, a key area in terms of it's going to be a turning point for the investors as they begin to realize how comfortable it is. So they will see some quality changes in this area. So they will be able to see that they can do it quite easily. So we are building about 8 million square meters of residential space every year. So I think probably if people start to use this, there will be less traffic jams in Moscow, at least small vans that carry documents. So we continue to provide information for the investment community, and now we are quite near implementing this goal, creating the personal accounts of developers at the Moscow government portal, where the data will be available for specific developers, for specific facilities in terms of the availability of documents, the state committee, a state expert commission, and they would be able to upload their schedules, to adjust them in online mode, and secondly, they will be able to, of course, to post their complaints, and thus communicating with the government directly. Thank you very much. Well, I think that was really impressive, what Sergei has just mentioned. We used to do research of the market, like IBM did, a research of the so-called smart grids, power grids, as we polled about 20,000 consumers and different power suppliers, and we realized that sometimes that people do not understand what the actual benefit is brought to them by the smart meters. So this has direct bearing on the return on investment, because every person understands the benefits of this.
And at the end of the session, we're very lucky because we can address the city that is one of the top 3 amongst the cities that receive direct foreign investments, Mr. Liu Thai Ker, that is the head of livable cities. The place good for living, and for a long time was chief architect of Singapore, the city that today is in many ways the icon of the city transformation. But in one sense, Singapore probably cannot be so lucky as Moscow to increase its territory 2.5 times by the power of the federal powers. Singapore is the city-state. What is the city of what's the story of success of Singapore? What lessons should other cities learn from how investment should go to the city in such a way so for tens of years it can remain the leader of this market?
Today we're talking about macro city or mega city, and Singapore is not even on the radar screen of mega city. But anyway, let me just quickly introduce. Singapore population grew from 1960 to now from 1.9 million to 5.5 million. our territory grew from 550 square kilometer to over 700 square kilometer. But our GDP grew from $400 per person to now $52,000 per person. So it is, we've done quite well. So many people say that, well, Singapore is a small place, and so it's very easy to actually develop. Yes, sometimes we agree that small is beautiful, that's what we say. But while it's easier to make decisions, but we have almost no resources, and therefore we are forced to work smart. I think this is the story of Singapore. I want to just touch on two topics. And one is that given such a small place, how can we guarantee continuous growth in terms of investment, industries and service industries and even housing? I think all I want to say is that we make long-term plan. Say in 1991, when I prepared the revision of the master plan, we had 2.6 million, and I planned for 100 years to 2091 for 5.5 million. Just as well we did that, because by today we have 5.4 million, but we still have about 60% of the land not used, and we still have another 100 square kilometer of land to be reclaimed. So don't worry, there's a lot of land for investment. And how did we do that? That means around 1990, we actually did a serious calculation to find out all the floor spaces needed for every single citizen for all the activities he needed, like living, working, pleasure, and so on. And that's how we went through a very thorough study to make sure that despite the smallness of Singapore, we have a very long-term development potential. And I think this is pretty much in line with the main theme of today's conference, and that is how can we be successful beyond the centers? We did that. So this is the first point. The second point I want to say is that beyond physical environment, we did take care of a few factors to make investment attractive in Singapore. First one is safety, extremely low crime rates, very high racial harmony. Second is credibility. That means our currency is totally reliable. Nobody worries about currency changes. Yeah, and also we have continuously lower taxation rates. Third is efficiency. We actually worked hard to provide a one-stop service for foreign investors. And fourth is good environment. It's a free environment, livable, with a variety of choices. Despite the smallness, there are many activities offered to people. Fifth is the readiness to offer space. In other words, any investor who comes in, they want a floor area, they want a piece of land, we're always ready to offer this for them with infrastructure available. And six is very clean administration and very efficient administration and high electronic usage. So it's very, you can actually make a decision very quickly with no hidden costs. All the costs you have to put in is on the surface. And number seven is that we do work hard to make it friendly for foreigners who live in Singapore, including foreign schools and so on. So people feel very comfortable in Singapore. And finally, despite the fact that with a higher GDP per capita, and therefore our labor cost is high, but we worked hard on raising the workers' qualification, raising our productivity, and also pushing very hard nowadays on research to move into the cutting edge of investment in Singapore. And in fact, a lot of a very high technologically sophisticated company come to invest in Singapore and conduct researchers in Singapore. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Now, at least for myself, I personally quite understand why a personal friend of mine has recently, for doing his business, moved from Munich into Singapore. He's German. So he's doing his business now not in Munich, but in Singapore. Ну и наконец.
And finally, thank you very much for all participants. Seems that we tried to look at the problem from all sides, and at the end, situation of selection of investor of the place of the corporate investments is described by the Russian classical literature. For our foreign participants, I'll say that there's famous comedy of Nicholas Gogol, Wedding, and Agafia Tikhonov. She is very picky bride. She said, if the lips of Nicanor Ivanovich stick to face Nicanor Kuzmich and take such freedom of Baltazar Baltazarich and add obesity of Nikolai Pavlovich, I will be marrying. That's how investors decide. Most important to build attractive proposal from financial standpoint and from the standpoint of quality of life. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, panel participants. Thank you for your attention.